The only way to save wild salmon is to catch and eat it. It sounds illogical, but that seems to be the endpoint if you follow the fanatical opposition to British Columbia's farmed salmon industry. Anti-fish farm activists claim the practice of raising Atlantic salmon in open net pens off the coast of British Columbia not only endangers wild salmon, it could decimate the entire Pacific salmon fishery. Hysteria and protest over salmon farming is nothing new to British Columbia. For over 3 decades, the industry has been harangued and harassed by radical environmentalists, a vocal contingent of First Nations, and left-leaning politicians like the current Minister of Agriculture, Lana Popham, a well-known opponent to farmed salmon. The future of BC's farmed salmon industry is now in the hands of Premier John Horgan and his NDP provincial government as it reviews 20 fish farm tenures located in the Broughton Archipelago off of northeastern Vancouver Island. Those tenures are up for renewal later this month. Central to the controversy over salmon farming is the predominant use of open net pens, which are floating cages secured by infrastructure and sited in narrow coastal waters, which maximizes the energy derived from strong tidal currents to help keep farms clean and fish safe, healthy, and strong. There are legitimate concerns over the use of open net pens, one of which was demonstrated last summer with the catastrophic collapse of a fish farm off Washington State that allowed the escape of 260,000 Atlantic farmed salmon into Pacific Coast waters. In March of this year, Washington State legislators voted to ban Atlantic salmon farming, a move certain to impact the provincial government's decision on fish farms here in BC, a decision that could include renewing tenures in their current locations, moving tenures to less controversial sites, or shutting those operations down altogether. The debate over salmon farming is at its most sensitive around the concerns held by those First Nations that believe the practice is destroying the traditional wild salmon harvest and devastating their culture. First Nations protesters have occupied multiple fish farms in the archipelago over the past year, and in conjunction with their partners in the environmental movement, are calling for a province-wide ban on marine fish farms in order to save wild salmon.
This needs to stop now. We're not leaving until we're satisfied that the situation has been handled. All parties have to sit down and figure out what they're going to do with this place. Get rid of the fish. Take these fish out and take away this fish pen.
So here's where the logic gets fuzzy. According to the most recent data the provincial government reports in 2015 and 2016, farmed salmon accounted for 80% of the entire salmon harvest in British Columbia. 80%. With this in mind, it's hard to see how closing down marine fish farms would save wild salmon. Sure, some of the enormous demand for BC farmed salmon would shift to overseas suppliers, but it's logical to assume the shutting of marine fish farms would also trigger a surge in demand for BC wild salmon, placing increased pressure on wild salmon stocks and thereby threatening the entire Pacific salmon fishery. But wild salmon wouldn't be alone under threat. So too would be the jobs of 6,600 British Columbians and the $1.5 billion in economic benefit the salmon farming industry delivers to the provincial economy each year. So it begs the question, how is it that this fuzzy logic could go unexamined in the battle to ban fish farms in BC? The answer is easy. A barrage of media headlines saturate public debate with a litany of scare stories hyping any disease, affliction, or event that might cast fish farming in a negative light and point to the imminent destruction of the wild salmon fishery. Many of these media stories are based on shaky science, riven with conjecture, and driven by an agenda that is foreign financed and activated by a bevy of environmental groups hell-bent on dismantling the salmon farming industry in the province. Joining us today to talk through the science around fish farming is veterinarian and marine biologist Dr. Hugh Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is an expert practitioner working with fish diseases and fish vaccines for over 30 years. He pioneered mass vaccination techniques in North America and is an advocate for sustainable fish farming. Dr. Mitchell, thanks for joining us on RegWatch. First off, you're Canadian, but your practice is down in Washington State. Please share with our viewers a bit of your background.
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology from the University of Guelph. and I have a master's in science and aquatic ecology from University of Toronto, in addition to my doctor of veterinary medicine from University of Guelph, the Ontario Veterinary College.
And Dr. Mitchell, in your practice, you work with salmon farms.
I work with salmon farms. I work with state, federal, tribal stock enhancement facilities, so wild salmon. I do farmed trout, tilapia, all sorts of species. I'm licensed in 13 states and provinces, so I get around, and I'm sort of a vet who would do production, herd health medicine for hatcheries, fish hatcheries, and commercial fish farms across the U.S. and in Canada too.
So your job and passion then is to keep fish alive.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'm obligated as a vet, yes. And how a production veterinarian, so just to go into the facets of veterinary medicine, you really have two categories. You have an individual companion animal veterinarian, dogs, cats, horses, and then you have production animal veterinarians, pigs, chickens, cattle, fish. And your job as a production veterinarian is to look out for the welfare and health and sustainability of that farm practice.
Well, speaking of farms, Dr. Mitchell, let's just jump right into it. As you're keenly aware, there's a massive battle going on over Atlantic salmon farming right now. One side says it poses a clear and present danger to wild salmon stocks. What do you think?
I don't see any real evidence that Atlantic salmon farming on the West Coast is a threat to the wild salmon. I have clients who are wild salmon hatcheries. So I see both sides. And I've actually told my Atlantic salmon clients, look, if I really saw this practice as a danger to my wild salmon clients, we'd have a fight here. You know, I really try and see truth. And it's a tough field.
Dr. Mitchell, you mentioned truth. We've heard a lot about the PRV virus that's been found in farm Atlantic salmon. The DFO has come out with a report which activists are using to gin up a lot of fear. What do we know about PRV virus and disease transmission overall from farm salmon to wild salmon?
It gets very complex. The direction of disease overwhelmingly is more from wild to farmed than farm to wild. Almost, I can say that with certainty.
Dr. Mitchell, isn't PRV virus a big deal?
Okay, it's a big deal. It isn't a big deal to wild stock enhancement facilities, state, federal, or tribal. Fish health managers involved in day-to-day activities of dealing with fish health. PRV is almost a non-issue compared to all the other diseases.
Dr. Mitchell, how does that square then with the fear-mongering we hear in the media?
I think in my entire career, I've seen fear-mongering with respect to fish disease. I have never seen anything like this, that's so disproportionate to the actual effect of the virus. So we were talking about viruses are a natural, bacteria, parasites are a natural part of animal and fish populations. And they get to a balance or an evolution where they're not really noticed that much or occasionally. This is a remarkable virus in that it can exist in the fish and the salmon in very high levels without the fish's immune system noticing it. In fact, it's only a problem when the fish finally says, oh, it's here, I got to react to it. And even then, the reaction is very mild. There's a heart and muscle inflammation. Most viruses you can work with in a lab. You can take them out of a fish, you can grow them on what's called a cell culture, which is like fish cells. So you can reproduce it, you can propagate it, and you can inject it back into the fish, and you can kill fish with it. So that's called Koch's postulates, and we've been doing that for years, and it's how we prove a disease is a disease, or a virus causes the disease. We cannot do that with PRV. We cannot grow it.
Dr. Mitchell, your position on PRV virus seems to run contrary to the recently released paper out of the DFO and Pacific Salmon Foundation.
The conclusion that paper made weren't supported by the research in the paper. How diseases move through populations in farms is distinctly different than what it is when they move through populations in the wild. This study only looked at farmed salmon, Atlantics and Chinook, and how the disease or how the virus responded in those fish. So you can't really extrapolate from that to all of wild Pacific salmon. It was just farmed Chinook. And that's one important flaw with that paper.
Dr. Mitchell, that research report is being used to attack the industry by anti-fish farm activists like Alexandra Morton, who tweeted 80% of farmed salmon are infected with a virus that makes Chinook salmon blood cells explode. What's your response to that?
She is fear-mongering on something that doesn't happen that way. And if it ever did happen, would not happen to that extent. We're not really sure that PRV virus by itself causes anemia, which a lot of the times is related to destruction of red blood cells. Most of the time, this virus stays in the red blood cells without being noticed, and the fish live through their whole lives. There's something that happens, either other diseases or environmental reasons, that cause salmon to react to this, and then things happen. Wild or farmed, it's been in the wild populations probably long before salmon farming.
And what about the hysteria, Dr. Mitchell, over the quote-unquote blood water?
So first of all, what wasn't pointed out was that processing plant disinfects its blood water. So any virus coming out as bad as that, red as that water looked, it was disinfected and everything was dead in it. They picked up PRV because, remember, this virus will not grow on cells like other viruses will. You can't take it in a lab and propagate it and put it into fish and kill fish. It just doesn't do that. So there was no way of knowing whether the virus was live or dead in that blood water, but it's disinfected. You'd still find the DNA, whether it was dead or alive. So it's disinfected blood water.
So Dr. Mitchell, let's bottom line this. Is PRV virus a clear and present danger to wild salmon?
No. Neither myself, my colleagues, or a lot of other researchers, including some of those in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, do not really think this is a problem. There are lots of other more serious diseases that should be investigated with a lot more rigor in both wild and farmed salmon than this one.
Well, that's it for this edition of RegWatch. Before you head off, please like us on Facebook and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. For RegulatorWatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.